Earlier this week, while I was sick with COVID and contemplating what I would make next, I came to the conclusion that I should make my mom a handmade journal. I started by printing off some DIY lined paper that I created in Google Docs. This is the same template I used for a previous video, which I will link at the end if you'd like to know how to print lined paper yourself. I printed off 32 sheets of lined paper, which were printed on both sides. I took the paper to my window view workstation and folded the sheets in half to make 8 signatures of 4 sheets each. Do you know how hard it is to do math when you have brain fog from being sick? I think I was lucky I didn't have to print off more lined paper because my ink had also run out. So I've learned to fold signatures a couple of ways. One way is to fold all the paper individually and then stack the sheets together, and the other way is to take the 4 sheets and fold them together all at once. Apparently the latter is better because it creates a rounded fold that prevents the glue from seeping between the signatures of the spine. I'm not an expert, but I am lazy, so guess which way I chose. Okay, enough about folding paper. Once the signatures were folded, I stacked and clamped them together. I was careful to make sure the spine was lined up when I did. That's the important part. I used the last of my brain power to figure out where the hole should be for sewing. I folded another sheet of paper and used it as a template, making a mark for one hole in the center and then every inch out from either side of that mark to either end of this sheet. I then used the template and a ruler to mark lines across the spine of the signatures. These will become sewing locations for binding. I then punch holes through the folds of each signature where the marks are, being very careful to come out directly on the other side of the fold. I was successful 80% of the time. Maybe that's generous. 70, 60% of the time. At this point I had a nap because I still wasn't feeling great. The next day I sewed the text block. I found a wonderful tutorial on HDTV that I followed for this sewing method. It's a cross between Coptic Stitch and Kettle Stitch, so if you learned Coptic Stitch for one of my previous tutorials, you can 100% do this. I'll link the HDTV video below with Rajiv Surindra because he explains everything really well and is a delight to watch. To sew the text block, I used linen thread that I waxed prior to use. I cut a long length of the thread, and after struggling to thread the needle, I doubled the thread and tied a knot at the end. Start by sewing from the outside to the inside of the first signature. I started with the bottom signature of my stack. Sew in and out of the holes to the end of the first signature and then sew back to the first hole. Tie a knot on the inside, then pull that knot gently through the hole to the outside. Pick up the next signature and sew into the first hole. Then sew to the second hole. When you come out of the second hole, sew under the threads that are on the outside of the second hole of the first signature. Then sew back into the hole again. Do this until you reach the end. When you've sewn under the thread of the last hole, pick up the next signature and sew into the last hole of it. This is when it becomes more like Coptic Stitch. When you sew across the signature and come out each hole, you will sew under the stitch between the previous 2 signatures before returning into the same hole. I'm showing you how to do this further on in the sewing process here just because it's easier to visualize. Continue sewing like this to the end of the signature. When you get to the end of a row, create a kettle stitch by sewing under the stitch between the last 2 signatures and then tie a knot before sewing into the next signature. If you run out of thread, tie a knot on the inside and pull it back to the outside of the spine. Thread your needle again and start by sewing into the hole you ended at. Keep sewing like this until you reach the end of the last signature. Then all you're going to do is sew out the last hole, create a kettle stitch, knotting off the thread. I doubled mine at this point just to make sure it didn't come undone. Then cut the thread, and boom, you got a text block. Woo! At this point I needed to glue and reinforce the spine, so I jury-rigged a press for the text block with a couple of pieces of pine and some clamps. There is always a workaround for these projects if you don't have something like a book press. And yes, I do have a book press, but need to make a bigger one. Mine is now a flower press. I applied a couple of coats of acid-free PVA to the spine, allowing it to dry in between each coat. I lacked any kind of traditional mold for the spine, so I used some fabric cut to the same width as the spine and glued it down. Then I glued a piece of cardstock over the top of my makeshift mull. Then I selected some butterfly fabric I had left over from a previous project. I used iron-on adhesive to strengthen the fabric. Regular fabric isn't great for bookbinding because the glue will just leak right through it, so I felt by backing the fabric I could still use it and make this journal for my mom super cute. I cut 2 pieces of chipboard down to the size I wanted the cover to be, making the front and back covers just slightly larger than the text block, and cut a piece that is the same width as the spine. I decided not to iron the book boards to the fabric because I needed to be very careful with their placement. I marked a line across the bottom of the fabric and glued down one cover. Marked a couple of spots a 1/4 inch out from the edge and glued down the spine board. And then repeated for the back cover. I placed the cover under a few heavy objects I had lying around to ensure the cover dried flat. You can see it bowing when I applied the glue to the chipboard. If you don't happen to have a rustic tray and some dinosaur statues lying around, you could always use a couple of heavy books for this. I waited for an hour or so, then trimmed the corners and glued down the edges, then returned the cover under the weights to dry. My hands were shaking during most of this project because of the strain of the virus on my system. I did make sure to rest in between each step, so don't worry about me. If you're not sick with COVID, you can make this journal in a day or 2. It's definitely a weekend craft, or just double that time if you need to take your time with it, as I did. A lot of people go through illnesses, and it's important that we still keep active for our mental health, even if all we can accomplish is a small step each day. Perfect, so now my cover is dry, and here's the step I absolutely dread and haven't got quite right yet, and the part where this book almost ended up tossed out of the window. Sorry, Mom. I selected some pretty fabric for the inside of the cover and end pages, and cut it down to size. It needs to be the same width and height as the text blocks and be long enough to reach the end of the covers. The paper I chose was not cardstock and was a lighter weight scrapbooking paper. Unfortunately, during the glue up, I tore the paper and it didn't end well. So I took a deep breath, ate some dinner, and decided to pick up my pride and try again. Don't worry if you aren't the best at something at first. No one is. Everyone starts somewhere, and as long as you keep trying, you will improve. Without mistakes, we'll never learn anything. I learned from my mistake that I needed heavier paper, and this time, instead of applying glue to the entire side of the paper being glued down, I only applied glue to half the sheet. This way I could smooth that area down first before moving on to the other half. Working in steps and taking this part of the process one step at a time helped me not toss this project in the garbage. I trimmed off the excess paper, then glued down the remainder of the sheet. It's not perfect. Handmade or DIY items rarely are unless you've been practicing those skills for a long time. But the imperfections are what makes something handmade and what makes them special. So I brushed my internal perfectionist aside and placed the book carefully under some weight to dry overnight. The next day when I removed it, I was surprised at how nice it looked, despite my previous mishaps and forgetting the end bands. Whoops. But next time I know what I need to do to improve, and that's all that matters. That and that my mom will have a cute new journal to write in. By the way, she's going to see this video before she gets this. So happy Mother's Day, Mom. I wouldn't be here without you. Quite literally too. Thanks so much for watching. My name is Pam, and this is Total Pamarchy, the craft channel with a little anarchy. Before you go, watch this video or this video next to learn some of the steps I talked about in this video. Until next time.